In the midst of sometimes all of the situations that are going around in Singapore and all over the world, I think we can lose this sense of God is personal, right? Because God is God above all things, but God is also my God.
Welcome to Hope Nation. We are glad that you're able to join us.
As we're finishing up our reflections on Psalm 91, there's been a lot of developments that has been going on all around the world and here in Singapore. Pastor Rodney, what are some of your thoughts, some of your impressions about what's actually happening all around the world?
Every day, I think all of us feel that constant shift, and now not only in Singapore but globally. We see the entire nation of Italy shutting down. We see U.S. banning travel from Europe. We see the NBA even shutting down to our possibility of that. So it's really caught all of us, I think, globally beyond our comprehension or our own experience. But as we close, I think this is a time that we need God's word more than ever.
Absolutely.
And so we just want to do a brief synopsis of this treasured, precious psalm that has encouraged people for over 3,000 years in their journey of faith. As we've been through verse by verse almost, I want to just hear from you, Pastor Kwan. What would be your reflection or your synopsis of the biggest impact on you as we've studied and as we've walked through and journeyed through Psalm 91?
You know, for me, this entire period has been a good time of reflection of who God is and what is core to me. And as I go through Psalm 91, the things that really stood out began in verses 1 and 2 and how it finishes up in verse 14 to 16, that there's really this personal image. In the midst of sometimes all of the situations that are going around in Singapore and all over the world, I think we can lose this sense of God is personal, right? Because God is God above all things, but God is also my God. And so when I read verse 91, it starts off with the psalmist or us claiming to God, God is my refuge, my fortress, my God in whom I trust. And then when you get to 14 and 16, God responds and says, because he has loved me, I will deliver him. And the use of those pronouns, I and him and you, and it to me just reminds me that God is with me. God is so personal. That although God is the Almighty, transcendent beyond all things and all universes and all powers, he is also so eminent, right? And he did this because he wanted that relationship. And so I think that's where the work of Jesus Christ and knowing him personally. Really
sometimes, though, crisis makes God feel distant, right?
Absolutely.
So I think your word is very encouraging that God is not only all-powerful, all-knowing, but he really is very close to us.
Yeah.
That this is a place that we personally can dwell.
Absolutely.
And not just cognitively know these truths, but really experientially know these, right?
Yeah. Well, for you as well, Pastor Rodney, as we've walked through this together verse by verse and section by section, what are some insights that you've taken away personally?
I think Psalm 91 has made different impacts or a different impact on me in different seasons. I think when I'm dealing with a personal crisis, obviously it's been my personal companion. Then when we deal with either a church crisis or city crisis, but this is a global crisis, so it's a little bit different, right? I see Psalm 91 as a companion. It's almost like having a divine dialogue where it depends on what you're feeling that day or at that moment, but there are different parts of Psalm 91 that ministers to me, encourages me. So that 16 verses is actually a dialogue where there are parts and bits and pieces, but the whole psalm walks with me.
Yeah.
And sometimes I tap a certain part, and sometimes the other part remains dormant, but then something activates the other part. So the whole Psalm 91 is at our disposal, and it is God speaking to us at different intervals. So I see Psalm 91 just as holding my hand in my heart through some very dark days.
Well, what are some sections, as we think about the pieces, what are some sections and some messages that you see that are coming out of Psalm 91?
The one that really has always caught me is God's part in the last 3 verses, where I cry to him, yes, all through the first 13 verses, and we declare him as that safe place. Then we declare him as the one who delivers us from enemies, and then we declare him as conqueror. But then at the end, God shows up.
Yeah.
And he, as we would say here in Singapore, he double confirms his blessing as our blesser. And so I believe that is really what has touched my heart the most. If you were to give a final word to our listeners in Psalm 91, what would your final challenge or word of encouragement be?
Mine would be that God is near, and that as long as we stay in his shelter, in his shadow, there's nothing that we need to fear. Of course, we need to be prudent and we need to be wise in how we live. But for me, as long as you are attached to the Almighty, in the shadow of the Almighty, there's nothing to fear in the way that we live our lives.
Wow. My final word of encouragement that says no matter whether you're in the fight or in the dark or in fear or in the pit, God has 2 words for you, and he says it 6 times. I will, I will, I will, I will, I will, I will. God is always moving toward us. Do not ever feel alone. God will be with you. Welcome back to Hope Nation. It's unusual how God has birthed this series and this time that we can spend with our IBCers and reaching out to them and giving them hope. I think just as your under shepherd, God had put Psalm 91 as our first and immediate response. It's where God speaks and where the psalmist and the word of God speaks, but we can clearly identify with that journey through Psalm 91. But we're going to take a little shift that God has given us a little different perspective, especially as we're on week 6 and week 7 of this journey. And as we open up a new season, this is what God has laid upon our hearts.
Absolutely. As we have a new season of reflection that comes out of Psalm 91, we'd love to hear any of the questions that you might have. Not necessarily of the virus itself, but maybe because of the virus, something that God is prompting in your heart. We'd love for you guys to submit the questions, and the pastoral staff and the ministry staff here will try to respond to as many as possible, because we'd love to hear your concerns. We'd love to hear what God is doing in your life. So if you can, please submit your questions by clicking the link below and by submitting whatever you have in your mind and heart.
We look forward to hearing from each one of you.